All right, I just want to take a quick second and oh yes, we are good to go. I'm going to go ahead and get started so we have plenty of time. So thank you all for joining us for our first lecture as part of our College of Arts and Sciences and Women and Gender Studies teach-in. And our first presenter today is Dr. Brenda Melendy, who's a professor of history. And I'm going to go ahead and pass the floor on over to her, and I'm going to be controlling the slides and letting her speak. So thank you for your patience. All right.
All right. All right. Well, thank you, Barbara. I'm really happy to have a chance to speak with you today on this topic. I was inspired by the teach-ins held by college professors at the time of increased U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, and more so by our own students who marched this summer and participated very actively in the Black Lives Matter movement. And I just really kind of want to keep that energy going. So my talk today will focus on Black activism at the 1968 Mexico City Olympics. I chose this topic because the leaders of the protest were situated in San Jose, California, which is my hometown. My father worked at the college there when these track stars were the best in the nation and in the world. So we were glued to our TV sets while the Olympics were happening. I know sometimes that people object that, politics and sports don't belong together, but they absolutely do, and I will get back to that at the end. But of course, we boycotted the Soviet Union Moscow Olympics when they invaded Afghanistan in 1979, and there are a myriad of examples. But basically, today I'm going to focus here on the Olympic Project for Human Rights, which was conceived by sociologist Harry Edwards. He was employed at San Jose State College at that time, and it reached its greatest prominence, as you know, at the 1968 Mexico City Olympics. So this is where I want to start. And Barbara, can you back up one? Okay. So this is a picture of the medal stand in Mexico City at the 1968 Summer Olympics. And here we see the winners of the men's 200 meters. Tommie Smith was the gold medalist, and he's in the center there, and he had just set a new world record of 19.83 seconds. Peter Norman of Australia took second, and John Carlos, who was Smith's teammate both on the US team and at San Jose State, he took bronze. Smith and Carlos, of course, in receiving their medals, they put up this symbolic action, and let me describe what these different meanings mean. These different actions mean the Black Power salute in a black gloved hand. They were shoeless, but were wearing black socks to comment on Black poverty. They wore black scarves around their necks to show Black pride, and beads to represent the many lives lost both to lynchings and to enslaved Africans being thrown overboard during the Middle Passage. The fists were raised as the national anthem played, which is what caused all the anger. Both men bowed their heads to show respect for the assassinated Martin Luther King Jr. as well as Malcolm X. And if you look closely, you can see that all three men, including Peter Norman, are wearing a badge on their left, the badge of the Olympic Project for Human Rights. So today I'd like to speak to the background of this movement, namely its organization and historic context, and the consequences and aftermath of these athletes' actions, and then also point to legacies of this specific sports activism. So in the late 1960s, both Smith and Carlos were students at San Jose State College in California. Both were there on track scholarships. Also at San Jose State at that time was Harry Edwards, himself a former track athlete at San Jose State, but he was at that time a professor of sociology. In September of 1967, there had been a near riot at the college where Black students protested over their exclusion from the fraternities and other extracurricular student groups. They also were protesting their exclusion from decent and equal housing. Some of those students, athletes and non-athletes alike, met at Edwards' home to think about the ways they could effectively protest. They recalled previous calls for Olympic boycotts and decided on that route themselves. Thus, the Olympic Project for Human Rights was born. Now, in 1984, much later, Edwards related the 4 domestic goals he had for the project, and I'm going to list each one and comment on each one. The first goal was to stage an international protest on the persistent and systematic violation of Black people's human rights in the United States. I'd like to point out here that terminology like systemic and violation of human rights was already being used in 1968. It's not a recent invention. His second goal was to expose America's historical exploitation of Black athletes as political propaganda tools in both the domestic and international sports arenas, particularly as the latter related to propaganda efforts aimed at the Third World. So, this comment does reveal the Cold War setting of the protest. It also shows the historical exploitation of Black athletes as its main point. Edwards gave the example of José Owens, who had turned in an amazing performance at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Within 12 hours of his victory there, his sponsor, the AAU, sent him on a European tour to participate in multiple meets. In 10 days, he raced 8 times and he lost 11 pounds. When he refused to continue, he was thrown out of amateur sport for life. Do Black athletes continue to be exploited by professional and college sports? Goal number 3 was to establish a standard of political responsibility among Black athletes relative to the interests of the domestic and international Black community. I think we are seeing this happen now through protests at different sporting events and the participation of so many athletes in community activities. And then finally, goal 4 was to make Black people and other oppressed people, particularly in the Third World, more aware of the substantial hidden political dynamics and consequences of established sports institutions and their participation in these. While the Olympic Project for Human Rights took as its primary target the International Olympic Committee, other established sports institutions include the NFL, the NBA, even the NCAA. All of these have hidden or not so hidden political and economic agendas. It is notable that the Olympic Project for Human Rights in 1968 took part of its incentive from across the Atlantic, where Black Africans had already been lobbying for the expulsion of South Africa from international sports competitions. And they were objecting to that country's continuing apartheid policy. Indeed, in response to those protests from Black Africans, the International Olympic Committee had banned South Africa from the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, and then due to another threatened boycott by Black Africans and Black Americans, South Africa was banned from the 1968 Mexico City Games as well. The OPHR's call for a boycott gained steam, and by March 1968, more than 60 Black athletes had, so they're in track and field, boxing, basketball, they had pledged to participate in the boycott. But, as is evident from the photograph I showed you earlier, and Black American athletes did not, in fact, boycott those Olympics. But members of the Olympic Project for Human Rights in 1968 had originally threatened to boycott unless 4 specific conditions were met. They wanted South Africa and Rhodesia, another apartheid country, to be uninvited from the Olympics. They wanted to see Muhammad Ali's world heavyweight title restored. It had been taken from him when he refused to fight in Vietnam. They wanted Avery Brundage, who was the president at that time of the International Olympic Committee. They wanted him to step down, and they also wanted to see a Black member put on the committee, because there was none at that time. And then finally, they wanted more African American assistant coaches to be hired. And I do find that interesting, that they're not asking for head coaches. They want assistant coaches, because I guess there weren't even those. So let's look at the next slide. Edwards and the athletes, and this is Harry Edwards in 1968. We'll see a picture of him today later. Edwards and the athletes had other concerns as well. As both as Black men and as Black athletes. Black athletes, Edwards explained, had for years formed important contributions to the success of U.S. teams, and it was time to object and refuse to be, quote, utilized as performing animals for a little extra dog food, end quote. On a less bitter note, he stated sports could act as a conduit to reach white America, who were glued to their TV screens every Sunday, and to thus teach those viewers about the lives of impoverished Black America. In a March 1968 opinion piece in the magazine Saturday Evening Post, Edwards made clear his disdain for the recruitment process and subsequent treatment of Black students on scholarships at the nation's colleges. He submitted that even though such athletes faced housing discrimination and social ostracism, the athletes went along with it because first, they couldn't risk their scholarships. Second, they felt physically safer when living in a mostly white environment, when they're part of a team. And then third, the athletic scholarship was their best path to a professional career in sports or otherwise. Edwards went on in the same article to criticize the hypocrisy facing Black scholarship students, writing, quote, athletes are beginning to recognize that breaking records doesn't alter their own status as second-rate citizens outside the sports arena, end quote. Further, and I continue to use Edwards' words here, his own words, he wrote, Negroes have been relegated to an inferior status because society feels we belong there. Too many athletes have sold out to whitey in the past. If we can show that our sense of personal worth and obligation is more important than any rewards we might be offered, and that we few represent the many, something may finally be accomplished, end quote. He cited the example at that time of O.J. Simpson, who in 1967 was a stellar athlete at the University of Southern California. And Edwards claimed that at that time, Simpson was worth at least $500,000 at the USC box office, which in today's dollars is about $4 million. And that doesn't even factor in the exponential rise in ticket prices since 1968. In spite of the many awards that Simpson won at and for the school, he could not join in 1968 about 90% of the groups that presented him those awards. So when I'm reading Edwards' comments about scholarship athletes, I'm reminded of recent moves by some college athletes to be regarded as employees. The student athlete is sometimes revealed as a fiction when players need to miss class in order to attend voluntary practices, when their graduation rates are lower than those of other students, or when they leave school with no degree once their eligibility has run out. These are clear echoes today of Harry Edwards' 1968 critique of college exploitation of athletes. And I know here at TAMAC we strive to get our athletes to have degrees. As you might imagine, Edwards and the athletes considering an Olympic boycott met with substantial backlash. Edwards, Carlos, and Smith all received death threats and hate mail. Edwards was offered a bribe of $125,000 to call off the boycott. And the most extreme vandalism that Edwards faced was the killing of his 2 dogs, and they were left on his doorstep for him to find when he went out for the morning paper. So why were these Black Americans like Edwards and Smith and Carlos, why were they still so angry even after the successes of the civil rights movement? And let's remember that the mainstream civil rights movement focused on legislative solutions to the problems prevalent in the South, primarily segregation and the denial of the right to vote. It did not even begin to address the problems affecting 70% of urban Blacks in the North, who were living in crowded urban areas and faced underemployment and poverty. In 3 consecutive summers, 1965, 1966, and 1967, America's inner cities erupted into riots and fires as African Americans burned the ghettos in which they were living. It was an effort to destroy what they could no longer stomach and which civil rights legislation seemed unable to change, namely the economic inequalities facing large numbers of Black Americans and fundamental prejudice and discrimination exercised by the white majority. This then was some of the history that led to that moment on the stands in Mexico City. You know, you kind of get a sense of why they felt the need to protest. So what happens next? The U.S. Olympic Committee was under pressure and threat from the IOC head Avery Brundage, and so they suspended Smith and Carlos. They banned them from the Olympic Village. They also banned the two athletes from international sports competition for life. Nevertheless, a modified form of the protest continued. The U.S. team swept the 400 meters. We see them there, Larry James, Lee Evans, also of San Jose State, and Ron Freeman. And all three men wore black berets on the medal stand. The world record-breaking 1600 meter relay team wore black berets and gave the clenched fist salute after receiving their medals. U.S. long jumpers Bob Beamon and Ralph Boston, they won gold and bronze in the Olympics, and Beamon set his world record, this astounding jump of 29 feet 2.5 inches, which held until 1990. The two long jumpers stood shoeless and wore black socks to protest both the black condition in America and the treatment of their teammates. Wyomia Tyus, who we see here on the left, she won back-to-back Olympic women's 100 meters in 1964 and 1968. She's the first person ever to do so. She also supported her teammates. Just after anchoring the women's winning 400-meter relay, she was asked by journalists, among others Howard Cosell, that probably most of you don't remember. She was asked what she thought about Smith and Carlos. And her response was this. She said, "What is there to think? They made a statement. We all know that we're fighting for human rights. That's what they stood for on the victory stand. Human rights for everyone, everywhere. And to support that and to support them, I'm dedicating my medal to them. I believe in what they did." End the quote. Smith and Carlos faced economic hardship after being banned from the Olympics and international competitions, but they finished college. They played professional football for a little while. They took advanced degrees. They became track coaches and teachers, and have been very busy in the past few years. So in 2003, in addition to the many other honors they had received, they were honored with a statue erected at their alma mater, San Jose State. The statue portrays that iconic moment at the 1968 Olympics. Peter Norman, the Austrian silver medalist, insisted that his spot in the statue be left unoccupied so that others viewing the statue could take a, quote, stand against racism, end quote. And it's heartening to see this little boy doing just that. Although Tommie Smith and John Carlos have since been lauded for their stance in 1968, the same cannot be said of Black athletes daring to make political statements today. Colin Kaepernick is the foremost example of this. His taking a knee during the national anthem to protest police violence against Black Americans was interpreted by many, including team owners, the NFL commissioner, and as dishonoring the flag and the military. Harry Edwards was interviewed in 2018 on this topic, and he said, quote, "I don't know of a single athlete who is trying to insult the soldiers or the flag, but because we're perceived to not have the credibility to speak on our own motivations and interests, it has come to this," end quote. Let's, for now, leave aside this odd conflation of flag and military. It's kind of like the weird conflation of God, guns, and country. And think what Kaepernick is doing here. He's protesting much the same as were Smith and Carlos. Was his action ineffectual? Maybe, as police killings of Black Americans has continued unabated. It certainly did him out of a job. The fact that NBA players could refuse to take the court this summer as a protest to the murder of George Floyd may indicate a shift toward employees being permitted to express their political free speech without losing their livelihoods. So, sports and politics, Black activism in sports? My point of view is that since everything in human society is political, then of course sports are political. What else would you call the Cold War era competition between the US and the Soviet Union on medal count? What else would you call the debate over which China should be allowed to participate in the Olympics? Even in the aftermath, and I just learned this recently, even in the aftermath of World Wars I and II, nations from the Central Powers in the first instance, and then from the Axis powers in the second, were banned from participating in the Olympics for several years because of their participation on the losing side of the war. So I've got a few final thoughts from Carlos, Smith, and Edwards. Carlos, on the right there, he noted that athletes today have a much broader platform than he did in 1968 because of social media. In September of this year, he commented on the walkouts by the NBA, WNBA, and Major League Baseball teams, saying this: "Right now, as a collective body, the athletes are telling ownership throughout sports, if you don't get up off your butt and start to make the right decisions relative to what's happening to your specific race of people that represents your dollar, if you don't get up, we will," end quote. Smith, on the left there, in June of this year, he called his raised fist in 1968 a cry for freedom. And now I quote him, "And now people are beginning to throw a right fist up and throw it up for different reasons. That's the way I have to see it, because so many people have died because they raised a fist in their hearts or took a knee in their souls to eradicate the knee to the neck." Finally, Dr. Edwards gives us some insight into understanding what has been called white privilege. At a college sports information directors conference in 2018, he called out what some believe to be a benign notion of unconscious bias, saying, and I quote him, "Don't tell me about it being unconscious. There is a total structure of social, physiological, and cultural scaffolding that allows individual bias and prejudice to find affirmation in discriminatory actions. That's not unconscious. It's deliberate. It's by design. It's exactly and precisely what it was drawn up to be," end quote. So I will be interested in hearing if any of you have some comments or questions. Some of the questions I'm left with, and maybe some of you have some ideas on these too, and I have 4 thoughts here. First, I'm asking, because I don't know, what has been the experience of athletes at Tamuk? Is the so-called hypocrisy described by Edwards something, and he's talking in 1968, remember, is that something that they have encountered in their sports participation to date? I also wonder, what is the proper role of activism in sports? Or turning this another way, why would we deny the rights of US citizens to US athletes? My third question is, what is political speech and what is human rights speech? And then, this is kind of not really a throwaway. This is meant to be inspiring, I hope. What do you want your iconic moment to be? So those are my questions. I wonder if anyone has anything they want to say about that. Shannon, rescue me. Well, I will say that I'm really glad that a number of you tuned in, and that you listened to me talking about something that means a lot to me, because, I told you at the beginning, I grew up there in San Jose. My parents were quite active in some of the civil rights movements. My first political act that I remember is walking with my mother to hand out leaflets asking for non-housing discrimination acts in San Jose, California. And, I must have been 10 or 11 at the time. Turn on the chat. How do we turn on the chat?
I'm seeing if I can do that. I apologize
Okay.
for that. I didn't realize I had turned off the chat.
And I only now hear you because well, maybe because you unmuted yourself.
I unmuted myself. I apologize. I'm trying to figure out how to audio
The
video
moderator
settings.
can turn on the chat, I'm
Now,
told.
there we go. I am very
Okay.
sorry for that. So please feel free to put all of your questions into the chat, and we can. There we go. Wonderful. Okay. Thank you. Oh, we're all learning. It's a learning process. It's the first.
Kind of a guinea pig. It'll go smoothly next week when we have a few more lectures.
Exactly.
Well, we've got the chat on, but we don't have any questions, so that's okay. I don't know. It's thank you, Dr. Melendez. Thank you, Dr. Baker, for getting my name wrong. That's my Mexican side coming out. Okay, that is supposedly my history. That was my name originally when the Spanish Armada crashed into England, and then some sailors crawled ashore and then anglicized their name. All right, what did I learn as a child from these protesters? So I mean, yeah, I feel like I learned, I learned at an early age that there was a problem. Let me put it that way. And, and then I looked around my elementary school when I was 10. I think we might have had one Mexican American person there. I remember in 6th grade, we had our first Black person. And, I kind of knew there was an issue. Much like Kingsville has been in the past, my town was also kind of divided. Certain people lived in one part of town and other people lived in another part of town. And the more I've learned about redlining, and I've looked at the maps for my hometown of San Jose, I've learned that, people of color just couldn't get a house loan. That, even veterans could not get an FHA loan, which every other white veteran was entitled to. So it was pretty amazing, actually. Someone mentioned Arthur Ashe and sort of a quiet activism, which I think is also very important. We see a lot of people just carrying themselves with pride and just through their actions, just demonstrating their human rights, their equality, there should be equality. So I don't know. I don't really have very much else to say. So
I have a question for you. So
okay.
I feel like a lot of people in our kind of, perhaps it's a reflection of our, by the way, I turned my video off because of the internet issues, but
Okay.
I feel like because of our kind of sometimes social dementia, if you will, we tend to forget recent history. Do you think that might be a reason why we have kind of socially often about past sports activists? So when Colin Kaepernick started taking the knee and all the controversy kind of exploded, it feels like people forgot that this was not a new thing.
Right.
Anyways, I just didn't know if you had any comments.
Well, yeah, it wasn't a new thing, but I think he was one of the first to actually, take the knee, to show that quote unquote disrespect. And there's such a custom, a tradition surrounding the starting of an athletic event, right? Everyone kind of marches out and they do a little warm up and, and I don't mean to be flip about it, and then they're all going to stand there. We even see this in international soccer competitions when they all stand there and their national anthem is played or the national anthem is played. And, you know, and there's a certain pride. I mean, it's more clear to me in international competitions, a certain pride in representing your nation. I know we haven't been playing the national anthem at sporting events since we started having sporting events. It's a relatively new phenomenon. But yeah, so I don't know if that's much help, but that's my answer.
Thank you. That's a wonderful answer.
You're welcome. Yeah. So Dr. Reinisch is asking about, is it not sad that, you know, we don't seem to have moved forward in 50 years? And, you know, the little bit of reading I did about recent events, because I was looking for more information about Harry Edwards, he has been working so closely with people like Colin Kaepernick. He's been working with the heads of the teams and the commissioner of the NFL to kind of try to guide them in a good way to conduct, you know, how can we make this protest without, or this comment without offending everybody? And I mean, I'm sorry to say that I think there's, it's, you know, so someone, why do you think it's so difficult to move on from this? We haven't embraced, I think, each of our own role in why there is still inequality. We remain ignorant of what we call our unconscious bias, I think because we choose to remain ignorant. And I mean, I can even think of very recent examples when, you know, in retrospect, I'm very embarrassed at comments I made to Black students or professors where I tried to express some understanding, but I was just saying stupid stuff because I basically was expressing, I have no idea, you know? And so it really comes, I think it's easy. I mean, the start is, of course, what we teach our children. And, you know, and then from then it moves on. I do think that, yes, once we have legislative responses and legislation in place, that then we think, okay, we've solved it. But what's been happening the last 50 years and longer shows that we haven't. You know, I'm thinking Jasper, Texas, and you know, Rodney King, and you know, we have not solved it for some reason, and I think it's very historic. You know, I referenced redlining. Well, families cannot build up family wealth unless they have an opportunity to purchase a home, for instance. And you know, if the rules of the realtors and of the city are not going to let them buy one, then, you know, 2 generations down the line, they have a much lower family wealth than anyone who, for instance, owned property in 1900 and their families. You know, and since we don't have what is negatively called a death tax, you know, they just get to hang on to that, and the whole family gets to keep it, even though they didn't even earn it. So anyway, that's my rant about that. Are there any other questions someone wants to pose, or repose if I haven't answered your question? Does anyone want to volunteer what their iconic moment should be? You could, my students, you can just write that in your comments if you want to, you know, and if you're going to turn something into me, you can put it in there if you don't want to expose yourself. I just try to teach justice, peace, and love, and we can take it from there. So I think we've kind of done it, Barbara. Barbara, I think you recorded it. Are we going to be able to post it later?
Yes. So we are going to be working out all the kinks to. Sorry, my toddler is trying to come on to the video right now. Of course, because. But yes, we are gonna be able to post this, and we're thinking of the best ways to do that, whether it's going to be through links or files or YouTube or what. So we will definitely make it available because we realize not everybody can attend all of them. I do want to plug our next one, which is going to be on Monday at noon, and that's going to be Dr. Nick Shulo, and it's going to be on. He's a very cute toddler. It is going to be on. Actually, kind of feeds right into what you were saying in a sense, academic activism. So how academics, I was about to say activate, that is not the correct, how they engage in activist activities through scholarship and theory. So that is going to be our next talk. And again, that's going to be Monday at 12. And again, you can find the links to that on the Arts and Sciences website and on our social media. So I do hope to see you all there.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks, everyone. I really appreciate that you tuned in and gave me this opportunity to expose my egotism. And so thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening, everybody.